Well, as we continue to look at Paul's conversation about how widows are to be treated in the church, and I just would note, as a side note, that obviously this was a very big problem in the church because Paul spends so much time talking about and explaining it to Timothy. Timothy, who was a younger man, grew up with a mom who was apparently married to a non-Christian, but at least he was somebody who was there to care for his family. But so Timothy didn't have a lot of experience, apparently, with how do you deal with the widow's situation. And Paul, therefore, goes into great detail talking about what was, for them, a very real and contemporary problem. As I've said, we live in a very different world, and so these things are a little bit harder to translate into the exact concepts or circumstances we face. But Paul has been talking about who can be allowed to be supported by the church as a widow. Now he goes on to talk about the younger widows. And he says in verse 11, and this was, really a concern for Paul, because he says, as for younger widows, women who are under 60 years of age and who are likely to remarry and even more likely to want to have children, he says, do not put them on the list. Why? For their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ. And I know that sounds really judgmental, but essentially, sensual desires are part of what God has created us with. And he says, essentially, they'll want to marry. And it makes complete sense, for a younger woman who doesn't have a husband. It makes complete sense that she would say, I would love to be married again. And every single mom I've ever met has pretty much had that same desire to meet a good, honest, godly man who would love her and love her kids. And that's my prayer for them all the time, that they would meet that kind of person. But he says the problem is that they may become so caught up in that they bring judgment on themselves, he says, because they have broken their first pledge. And their first pledge is to be faithful to Christ. And in other words, people who were put on the list were really women who disavowed any interest or goal or purpose in getting married and serving their family. They were now committed to serving the church and the ministry of God. And he says what these younger women will do is they'll meet somebody and they'll break that pledge. They'll break that commitment and they'll leave the calling that they were put into. It may sound a little harsh for me to say, but I think it's really important that one of the things I've seen has been probably the most damaging thing to the work of the Lord is people who just give up or quit in the middle. I think of all the time we have people who will volunteer to do something, and then when they find out how hard it is, they immediately say, well, I didn't realize it was going to be this hard, so I'm going to quit. And then they leave a big vacuum that we have to scramble to try to fill. There's something about being faithful. In fact, I was asked many years ago what was to me the most outstanding characteristic about my wife. And other guys would talk about, she loves me and she's kind to me and she treats me nice. Well, my wife did all those things too. And I valued that, obviously. But the thing that really stood out to me, and has always been one of the highest values for me in people and relationships, is their faithfulness. They're the same yesterday, today, and forever. They're there through thick and thin. That's the way God is. God doesn't discard me because I'm not behaving very Christ-like in that particular moment of that day. And this is the thing I just admired about so much about my wife, because she was just committed to me, to her family. She just committed through and through. Even as we deal with, aging parents, we have one left, and she's just committed to doing whatever it needs to make their life better and easier and make sure that they're cared for. And that includes not only financially, but also a lot of time and a lot of prayer. And so this is something I think that he says that, you need to make sure that the women who are put on that list are women who are faithfully committed to serving the church now that the church has become like a husband to them. And, Christ is their husband, but certainly the church has become this family that they have been taken into. Because he says, besides all of that, and he says a concerning part, they get into the habit of being idle. In other words, instead of doing good works and serving and being active in ministry, they just realize, I've got food, I've got shelter, I'm taken care of, and they get used to just being idle, or we might call it today lazy, and then they start going from house to house And not only do they become idlers, he again says, but they become gossips and busybodies, and they say things they ought not to. It's interesting that Paul would go there because there's probably few behavioral characteristics that get more prescribed in the scriptures, not prescribed, but proscribed. It means spoken against, is the idea of being a busybody, a meddler, a gossip, somebody who goes around just listening for the latest tidbits of information that they might pass it on to somebody else. I remember years ago there was a pastoral website where guys would write and share things, and it really became a kind of a Christian version of the Tattler, which was a paper years ago that just simply spread gossip. And I think even today, much of our media is really just a means of sharing gossip about all sorts of things, not really giving you truth or information or even what we would call news. They just give you garbage that you can share and be titillated by or scandalized by, or however it affects you. And I think it's really important that we realize that that's one of the behaviors that God really, really dislikes. In fact, think about how many times it's mentioned in Scripture. It really struck me when I started doing a word study. For example, Peter says in 1 Peter 4:15, he says, if you suffer, and he's talking about suffering persecution, it shouldn't be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal. And then he adds, or even as a meddler. In other words, even as a person who sticks their nose into other people's business. In fact, in Proverbs, Solomon said, a person like that is like a guy who picks up a dog by his ears. You pick up a dog by his ears, don't get surprised if he bites you and you regret that you had chosen to lift him that way. And that's essentially, he said, that you're just inviting people to react negatively to you. In fact, in Leviticus 9:16 in the law, God told Israel, do not spread slanderous gossip. Slanderous gossip. What is slanderous gossip? It's telling stories about people that you hope will diminish them in the eyes of the people you're telling it to. And that's essentially, when we share things that go on, we share events or things that are taking place in our life, or some things that are going on in the lives of people we love, that's not necessarily gossip. A lot of times we share stuff, hopefully, that other people will join with us in prayer and support us and support those ones that we love. But slanderous gossip is things we say that we hope will diminish that person in the eyes of that other person so that they'll think less of them. Psychologically, it's kind of a thing called triangulation, where you talk to person A and tell them how bad person C is, and then you go tell to person C how bad person A is, and you tell person A that you're their best friend, and you tell person C that you're the best friend. But the truth of the matter is, you're just trying to find a way to put yourself in the center of the conversation and get everybody to focus and feed into you. It's called a narcissistic personality or behavior. And so he says, don't become that person who wants to be the first to tell the rumor that really makes somebody else look bad. So, so sharing is different than gossiping. In fact, in Proverbs 11:13, he says, a gossip goes around telling stories or telling secrets, but those who are trustworthy can keep a confidence. It's amazing to me that somebody would share something uncomplimentary about somebody else just because they want to make conversation. But that's often what the case is. What do I benefit from learning this thing about that person? Absolutely nothing. And so there's no value you have to really ask yourself a question, is what I'm sharing edifying and building up the person I'm sharing it with, or is it just simply giving them information that can continue the conversation, going away from looking at ourselves and focus upon the weaknesses and the struggles of other people? He says this over and over again, like Proverbs 16:28, a troublemaker plants seeds of strife. Gossip separates the best of friends. Or 17:4, wrongdoers eagerly listen to gossip, and liars pay close attention to slander. Or chapter 20, verse 19, a gossip goes around telling secrets, so don't hang around with these kind of chatterers. Proverbs 25:10 says, others may accuse you of gossip, and you'll never regain your good reputation. As my wife had said to me, that when she meets people who are starting to tell her stories about other people, she says, I realize it's probably only a matter of time before they'll start telling stories about me. And so I'm not really interested in going further. In fact, in Proverbs 26:20, he says, fires go out without wood, and quarrels disappear when gossip stops. Or Romans 1:29. Paul talks about the idolaters and the evildoers, and he says, their lives become full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. You know, one of the saddest things, I had a lady come to me one time for counseling for her marriage, and she didn't go to our church. And I asked her, I said, why don't you go to your own pastor? And she said, I can't. I said, why not? She says, if I talk to him, he'll talk to his wife, and his wife will tell everybody in the church what's going on in my marriage. And I thought to myself, is that possibly true? And so I asked a friend of mine who was familiar with the congregation, and I said, is that true? And he said, it's absolutely true. No, I'm not going to tell you which church it was or who was involved, because that'd be gossip. But I'm just saying it's such a devastating thing because it breaks down the bond of trust when we feel like other people are going around saying critical and disparaging things about us. It's obvious, isn't it? Anyway, we got one more to go this week and we'll wrap it up. See you then.